Ben Shapiro needs no introduction in this room. The Daily Wire, the Ben Shapiro Show, millions of Twitter, Instagram followers, dozens of books, and the list goes on. But he's here tonight for a specific reason. Because he uses that incredible reach and that powerful voice to be an unabashed supporter of Israel. He takes that message on the road to college campuses where the message maybe needs to be heard the most. He wears his yarmulke proudly. He's never ashamed or apologizes. He's always proud to be a Jew, to stand up against anti-Semitism in defense of Israel. Ben, thank you so much for being with us. Ambassador Friedman certainly needs no introduction. It's really an extraordinary thing to be up here with the United States ambassador and one of the most famous and popular media personalities on earth. It's really something which is extraordinary and we don't take for granted. So I want to begin with the following question to both of you. Ben, in your role, in your show, the positions that you take, you have an enormous following of people who agree, but you have many who disagree with almost everything that you say. An ambassador, in your role in the previous administration, you have many supporters and fans and followers, but there are those who are never what you stood for. What would you both say to somebody who disagrees with you on almost everything about why they should agree with you on Israel? To set aside those differences, to put aside what they can't work with you on, and why Israel is different, why Israel matters, why Israel's right, and why they should be with you. Ben, let's start with you.
I mean, first of all, everyone should always agree with me, but beyond that, Israel is a consensus issue, or at least it should be a consensus issue, because it's very difficult to see why it would not be. And one of the more astonishing elements of modern American politics is that this has become a more and more partisan issue over time. When I was growing up, and I'm not that old, even 20 years ago, 25 years ago, it was widely assumed that both parties were going to be at least somewhat equivalently pro-Israel. It's a general baseline assumption that everyone was going to be pro-Israel. It doesn't seem like that is the direction in which the parties are moving right now. And frankly, I find it bewildering, except that the argument against Israel is not an independent one. The arguments that people make with regard to opposition to Israel cannot be separated from broader arguments that are generally made about the necessity for quote-unquote fairness and opportunity, because the way that so many people tend to think right now is they believe that if they see one person in a room who has $5 and one person with $1, the person with $5 must have taken the money from the person with $1. And when they look to the Middle East and see that Israel is successful, the idea is that Israel must have done something terrible in order to achieve that success at the expense of the people who are trying to destroy the state of Israel. The only way, I think, to make the case is to get at the root of why people are, in fact, anti-Israel, and also to really assess whether the argument is worth making to people in the first place. I really do believe that every conversation has to be assessed for the possibility that you're wasting your time. And then you really have to assess whether each conversation is worth it. Because if somebody is open to actually knowing about Israel, if somebody's open to learning about Israel, this is such a clear-cut moral case. It is certainly the most morally clear-cut case in any foreign policy issue on earth. You have one country that is a liberal democracy that strives to preserve the lives of even the people who are trying to destroy it. And then you have opposing it a series of terror groups who have been elected some 2 decades ago to serve 4-year terms. It's astonishing that this is even remotely controversial. The fact that it is controversial suggests what I'm saying before, which is that there are deeper issues at play that really need to be argued outside of Israel. Israel is almost a tertiary issue for most of the people who oppose it.
So I agree with Ben. I agree with Ben's observation. I would take it one more step. Look, first of all, there's a lot of people who will never like Israel and can never be made to like Israel because they're not looking for an honest discussion or a rational discussion. But what I would say is the more important thing is not to convince people who don't like Israel to like Israel. The more important thing is to convince people who are, especially Jewish people, especially people who are lost right now, not why they shouldn't be against Israel, why they should be for Israel. My views are not uniformly accepted. I'm comfortable saying this even when I was a public servant. I start with the notion that Israel is derived from a ordained biblical promise that the Jewish people would be restored to their ancient homeland, and it happened. It happened against all odds. First thing that at least Jewish people should do, and Christian people should do, is they should see the miracle, and they should understand the history. It's a 3,000-year-old history. There is no other people. The Phoenicians are gone. The Nabateans are gone. We're the only ones left. I think once you understand that, and you understand that you're on a multi-thousand-year continuum, and we don't want to break the chain. That I think is the starting place, because without that, it's just another country, and it's the same political nonsense we talk about all the time.
In different arenas, and with different risks, you both are staunch advocates for Israel. Unapologetic, unabashed, eloquent spokespeople for Israel. In the halls of the State Department, Ambassador, as you just spoke about, not a popular place to be. maybe Jewish, let alone or pro-Israel, and the media, which leans in a certain direction. It's not so easy or popular, and those who've seen the videos on college campus and security tonight looks like nothing compared to what you need in some of those environments. And yet you choose to do it. You speak the truth, you stand up, and you're on the front lines of fighting in the arena of politics and in the arena of the media. Where does that come from? Who inspired you? Who motivated you? Is it a person? Was it a family member, a teacher? Was it a trip to Israel? Is it a place in Israel? Where does that resolve come from that gives you the courage to stand up when both of you could advance your careers without making Israel one of those top issues? Ben.
So first of all, I have to say that I'm sure that Ambassador Friedman and I are going to say very much the same sort of things here, especially because the first time that I actually met Ambassador Friedman was in Israel a few years ago. It was right before the opening of the embassy. We were actually privileged to visit his office before the opening of the embassy, and he showed me a picture on his wall by a very elderly Jerusalem-living woman in Huvi. It's a beautiful painting of the Meraglim who are bringing back the fruits of the land of Israel, and it's right before they're about to announce that that the Jews should not enter the land of Israel. I remember you suggesting that the reason you had that on your wall is to remind yourself to have courage, that it was the lack of courage of the Meraglim that led to 40 years in the wilderness. So have courage and make that move. I will say on a specific personal level is derived from my father. If you ask me what his Judaism is about, it's about loyalty to the Jewish people and loyalty to an unbroken chain of Jewish history that he does not want to be the one to break, and he feels a real duty to push that forward into the next generations. I certainly feel that same duty. On a sort of day-to-day level, honestly, it's something that I don't think about. You know, people ask me why I wear a yarmulke in public life, and the answer is, why wouldn't I wear a yarmulke in public life? I remember when I was 17 years old, and I was thinking about wearing a yarmulke on TV or not. I remember my father said, "Are you sure you want to wear a yarmulke on TV? You want to give me the choice?" And I said, "Well, I mean, I've been wearing it so far. I don't see what's going wrong thus far." And so it never was sort of an option not to take off the kippah. And I think that it's worthwhile approaching. Well, it's funny. In Judaism, it's seen as a bad thing to be casual about your Judaism, because you shouldn't be casual about your Judaism. But the truth is that when you live life on a daily level, you're always casual about the things that you do on a daily level. Well, we should be just as casual on a daily level about being proud Jews as we are about being proud Jews in the community where we live.
You mentioned being there for the embassy opening. Is there a particular trip or a particular place in Israel that stands out for you when you go to Israel that you're most excited about or that you walk away most inspired?
Well, I mean, the place that is still controversial to mention is going up on Har Bayit. So I did. I mean, I went to mikvah, I went up on Har Bayit. I think the Jews should go up on Har Bayit. It's controversial territory. But I believe that we should, frankly, I think we should build a shul on Har Bayit. It seems to me if they have a dome in mosque, having a shul up on Har Bayit is not a bad idea. To say anything except for the holiest site of Judaism, which is not in fact the Kotel, but is in fact Har Bayit, would be a mistake.
Okay, Ambassador, where does your passion come from?
So I said that once, and I started a riot when I was ambassador. So I'm not going to say it again. It didn't work out well the first time. Look, I am my father's son. My father was a pulpit rabbi for 50 years. My parents, I remember them crying in early June of 1967 when Jerusalem was reunited. They immediately made plans for my bar mitzvah at the Kotel, even though they had 4 years to plan. They started planning immediately. In 1973, my father, we heard on Yom Kippur, we heard that there was a war that began in Israel, and we were getting, I remember we were getting news that the Syrians were going down, had already breached the Golan Heights, and the Egyptians were already halfway into the Sinai. And my father, who actually had on Yom Kippur, his congregation was about twice the size of this. Imagine that. And he, after Ne'ilah, he told all the ushers to close the doors, not to let anybody out. These are hungry Jews, remember? Hungry Jews. Very dangerous to get between hungry Jews and their food, right? And he said, lock the doors, and we don't leave until we raise, I think in those days it was probably $250,000, but we raised $250,000. I understand that Israel's very low on supplies. We raise that money, and then he can go home and eat. And I remember people were saying, is he violating the fire code? Can he do this? He didn't care. He didn't care. Look, it had a deep influence on me, and very, and I tell this to my friends in Israel all the time. the world will respect us when we respect ourselves. We must respect ourselves first, and then all things will go to
Maybe the ambassador's residence is your favorite place in Israel now. Obviously, having just spent a long time there, you saw many places, had many experiences. Particular place in Israel stand out for you?
Yes, it also almost caused a riot, but I happen to love Hebron. I do. As I like to say, it's the first transaction recorded. It's a real estate transaction by a Jew who paid retail. The last time a Jew paid retail for a piece of real estate. I think he overpaid actually. So it means a lot to me, yeah.
Hebron's a wonderful and holy site. Ben, you tweeted something a few days ago that really touched me. A professor of yours from law school passed away, and you wrote that even though in the classroom you disagreed on absolutely everything, and you battled vociferously on those issues, but you had a wonderful relationship outside the classroom. She actually wrote you a recommendation, or used her as a reference, and that she was a lovely person who had nice things to say. You know, we're living in a world where, whether it's on the topic of Israel or so many other topics, people who disagree can't do so agreeably. They're unable to say kind things or have a relationship, and therefore it stunts our growth as people and as a community. Israel is that hot button issue that so many people are divided on, and it causes people to stop talking. So how can we overcome that? Even the people that we can't persuade, how can we use our language to ensure that Israel and other things don't become divide issues that set us apart? How can we maintain our humanity, our connection, our community? It's sad because that memory was from a long time ago. I wonder if there's anyone more recently that you could send that tweet about. It seems today that the people we disagree with, we vilify, we distance, we reject, and we have trouble connecting. So I'd love to hear, as a diplomat, where language matters and you have to be able to negotiate with people who are different, in a media world where you have relationships with people who you disagree with a lot, how can we overcome that to create some headway and some unity?
Well, I mean, I was at a conference fairly recently, this was last year, and there were a bunch of people. I was probably the only conservative at the conference. 400 people, these are some of the top people in virtually every industry. I think everybody there was pretty much a household name, and this topic came up, of political polarization in the United States. And I said, we can solve political polarization right now in this room. All you all have to do is take out your phones and go on Twitter and name a person who voted differently than you did in the last election and say they're a nice human being and I enjoy getting coffee with them. That's literally all you have to do. No one did it, of course, because to do so means that you're going to receive an extraordinary amount of blowback from your own side. Now, I've done this. I mean, I literally performed this exercise, 6-7 months ago, where I tweeted out just an entire list of people who are on the left, with whom I feel like I'm friendly and they're nice people, and we disagree on a lot of issues, but we can still respect each other's right to exist. I do think that is dying. I do think that it is largely predominantly unidirectional at this point, and I think that is a real abiding problem. It comes down to what I've called before the happy birthday problem. I have a lot of friends on the left. I'm happy to say happy birthday to them publicly. They will text me privately, happy birthday. But will never say happy birthday publicly for fear of the admission that I was born quoted. The answer is, as always, if you treat people with a certain amount of decency publicly and treat them as though you know them as opposed to when you're online, then you'll do better. I will say that, to quote one of my friends, Dennis Prager, when it comes to the state of Israel, when it comes to deep-seated issues, clarity has to be prized above agreement. And clarity has to be prized, in some cases, even above civility. And when it comes to existential issues, like, for example, the existence of the state of Israel, those are issues where if somebody is offended and you lose a friend over it, frankly, so be it. There are certain core issues that really, I think, are worth losing friends over, and that is one of them. There can be differences of opinion about specific policies of the Israeli government. It's another thing to argue that the state of Israel should not exist. Once that happens, it's very difficult to carry on a conversation in good faith.
That's it.
We've lost a good deal of our civility, of our dignity, of our humanity. By the way, it's hard for me to watch the Knesset, with people screaming at each other, coming almost to blows. It's the views are all heartfelt, but you can't move forward when you're vilifying, and it's harder for me in Israel because I like to think that the Jewish people could overcome at least their ability to deal with each other on a human level. Frankly, Rabbi, this is where you come in, because Ben's not going to solve this problem, and I'm not going to solve this problem. I'm not switching sides, and he's not switching sides, and we're not reaching out to the point where we're going to undercut all that we believe in. But you know, there's an arbiter of all these disputes, right? And it's God. You know, God ultimately has the truth, and the truth is expressed, you know, by those scrolls that are behind us, and by those who communicate God's teachings. And you know, it's a lot easier. You know, anybody can argue with Ben Shapiro or David Friedman. Much harder to argue with God. You don't want to pick a fight with God. And so your ability to study Torah and to learn with people and to get them to sort of understand what God wants of all of us, I think is the last best chance we have.
Thank you. You're both very publicly observant Jews. You're religious in your practice, unapologetic for it. Tell us a little bit about what religion, that relationship with Hashem, with God means to you. You just referenced the importance of Torah study. Could you share about setting time aside, or what you study, or how you continue to listen to the voice of God through studying His Torah? Is there something that stands out, Ambassador?
Look, I think I think there's, for my job, the Tanakh is so incredibly informative, helpful, useful. You study, especially, you know, the books of Joshua, of Judges, of Samuel, of King David, Solomon. I mean, you know, so when I took a course in Bible when I was in Columbia, the professor said, you know, if you just read this stuff, you would think that whoever wrote the Bible was an anti-Semite, you know, because all the sins of the Jewish people are laid bare. There's no attempt. There's no mythology here. There's no attempt to cover up and you see how people's human failings can undercut everything that they want to do, you know, in the public sphere. And so, to me, it spoke to me really in terms of the need to really lead and I'm sure that I've sinned a million times and I will continue to do so, but at least I tried to think, you know, what are the lessons, you know, especially, you know, when the prophets, especially the lessons of the prophets really spoke to me. And you know, in the words of Moses when he was about to pass away, and really just sort of the enormous criticism he had for the Jewish people and what they've done wrong. And I said, well, you know, we've got a real blueprint here for the mistakes we shouldn't make. We'll make other mistakes, but let's try to stay away from sort of these human failings that we've been inculcated with. We all have pride. We all have desires. We all have needs. But you know, we need to control them, and God tells us how, and that really did speak to me.
Beautiful. Ben?
So I study once a week with you. I study once a week with Rabbi Gimmer, and then I do a lot of reading on my own. But I would say that my chief focus, like Ambassador Friedman's, is on Tanakh itself. The deep and abiding wisdom of the Chumash is just extraordinary, and that's felt not just by Jews. I think it's felt obviously by Christians, but it's felt by non-religious people as well. You know, Thomas Sowell is fond of suggesting that the sort of knowledge that we prize in modern society is so-called scientific knowledge. Right? It's been tested, it's been verified, but the truth is that wisdom that has been passed down over the course of ages has also been tested and verified. If something lasts the test of 3,000 years and it's passed down with such unbelievable care, this treasure that's been passed down bears extraordinary amounts of wisdom. And that wisdom is accessible to anybody who can pick up a book, unlike somebody who requires a scientific degree in order to understand what's going on in a particular scientific text. You don't need a scientific degree to be able to pick up the Chumash and understand the stories of our forefathers, and understand the stories of Bereshit, which I think virtually all wisdom about human nature can be found in probably the first 10 parakim of Bereshit. And human beings don't change. Because human beings don't change, that means that the words of the Torah remain eternal.
So, big recommendation tonight. Everybody pick up your Tanakh, Bible, and study it every day. It will inform you, it'll keep you grounded. We're going to head towards the end with just 2 more questions. One is, tonight is really about standing with Israel and standing against anti-Semitism. Ambassador, you spoke about this a little bit in your keynote address, the connection between the two. So then we'll start with you. what's the connection between Israel and anti-Semitism? Are those parallel issues? Are they overlapping issues?
I mean, there's certainly overlapping issues. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs recently suggested, before he passed away, he did a video in which he explained the connection between anti-Semitism and anti-Israel sentiments. He said that if you are seeking to destroy the state of Israel, which is a repository of some 6 million Jews, 7 million Jews at this point, that can't be seen as anything other than an attempt to destroy Jews. If you're talking about the central gathering place for all Jews and you say this should not exist, it should go away, it's hard to read that as anything other than Jew hatred. There really, I think, when it comes to anti-Semitism, 3 theories of anti-Semitism that are out there and that have been historically present. One is religious anti-Semitism, so various religions suggesting that Judaism is bad or wrong. That has, at this point, centralized, I would say, in sort of the fundamentalist Islamic community. Then you have the idea of racial anti-Semitism, which really rose post-Darwin with the Nazis. You can still find crossover with that with some folks who are on the far right in European politics and also in fundamentalist Islamic countries. And then there is a sort of left-wing anti-Semitism, which is tied into that theory I suggested before. It's almost a conspiracy theory about power, which is that anyone who has power must have done something wrong in order to obtain that power, and therefore all power relations must be flattened out. And then if you apply that to Jews broadly, or if you apply that to Israel specifically, Jews tend to be disproportionately wealthy, they tend to be disproportionately well-educated, and Israel is disproportionately wealthy and well-educated, which means they must have done something wrong. So the sort of intersectional conspiracy theory that is represented in American politics has consequences for foreign policy as well. You can see how all of these things cross streams with hatred for Israel. It's hated for its racial composition and its ethnic composition. It's hated for its religious composition, and it's hated for its success.
You mentioned before that it's legitimate to criticize policies, but not the existence. So you can name a particular policy that you're against, or without speaking specifically, how would one do that? How could you acknowledge there's a policy you disagree with without it being an expression of anti-Semitism?
I mean, it really isn't that difficult. We do it in the United States all the time. We criticize politicians all the time for policies they're pursuing without saying, also, we don't think the United States of America ought to exist. Right? But people seem to have trouble with that with regard to Israel. It's amazing to me. I was traveling fairly recently, some domestically and a little bit outside the country, and it's incredible the double standard that is applied to Jews in the United States. So, for example, South Florida obviously is a heavy Cuban population. The Cuban population here has deep roots with Cuba and deep loyalty to Cuba, and they want to see Cuba liberated, which it should be. Right? God willing, it will be liberated at some point in the near future. Nobody in American politics ever suggests that Cuban Americans have dual loyalty, because that's absurd. Of course they don't have dual loyalty. The same liberty that motivates them in the United States motivates them with regard to Cuba. When it comes to various countries around the world that have actual ethnic requirements for example, gaining citizenship. There's some of that in, for example, the Bahamas. Nobody ever mentions that with regard to the Bahamas because who cares, right? When it comes to Israel and the right of Jews to return to the land of Israel and gain citizenship, somehow this is wildly out of the box. The double standard that is applied to Jews, to Israel, now the State Department has said for years that represents a form of anti-Semitism, and it does represent a form of anti-Semitism. So there's really a couple of types of critiques of Israel that are anti-Semitism. One is Israel does not have the right to exist as a Jewish state. The second is Israel ought to be criticized for things no other country would be criticized for, and you see those all the time.
Ambassador, in your case, there was some resistance from your named ambassador that an observant Jew or a Jew who's been in a lay leadership position of organizations that State Department or mainstream maybe opinion disagrees with. So how have you experienced personally in that rise and in the role that you played, some of that overlap between Israel and anti-Semitism?
Look, I was fighting from the day I started until the day I left, fighting somebody, and tried not to lose. Winning's better than losing. So tried, and I had great support. I had, the reality is when you have the President of the United States supports you, likes you, trusts you, gives you a lot of authority, you're not going to lose. It's not me. It's that I was given a huge amount of authority. But I had a very I would say Ben gave the 180 IQ answer before. I'm going to give like the 110 IQ, answer, which is very simple. Judaism is in large part about the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. That's what Judaism is. You can, there was a time back in the late 19th century when you had, the Pittsburgh platform with the Reform movement, and then they wanted to assimilate into America, and they said that we no longer hold any aspirations to return to our homeland. But that was quickly dispersed once after the Holocaust. And everybody agrees that Judaism, no matter where you live, Judaism is in large part about the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. So if you do not support the state of Israel, you do not support Judaism, therefore you're anti-Semitic. That's my 110 IQ answer to your question. Simple.
Finally, with tremendous gratitude to both of you for being here. Finally, tell us, ladies and gentlemen, appropriate tone, this is not simple. The United States Ambassador, Ben Shapiro, an audience, an amazing evening. There's a lot to be grateful for. So last question. Give us something positive. Tell us something you're optimistic about Israel, about the U.S.-Israel relationship, about the world's support for Israel. We tend to get together at these evenings, these celebrations, these nights, and you know, the way they're successful, you get people there, certain Jewish organizations thrive on this, is every year you got to describe Israel as facing the most threats it's ever faced, it's the worst news it's ever had, it's most on the brink that it's ever been, and that's how you get people to come, and that's how you get people to join, and so on. So we're used to hearing the bad news, and there's no shortage of it. Give us some good news. What are you optimistic about? Certainly the Abraham Accords and the changes that happened in your administration and that hopefully, please God, will be built upon are extraordinary. They're historic, and hopefully tell us something more that's happening in that arena. Ben, from what you see and what we know from you publicly, but also what you're experiencing behind the scenes, give us something to be excited, positive, and optimistic about. Ambassador.
Well, first I'll tell you what I told the Knesset in my final words to them. They were nice enough to have me over, and I offered a few words. And I said this. I said, the Jewish world now resides in Israel. It's no longer, the Jews are no longer a majority in the diaspora, they're a majority in Israel. I said to everyone in the Knesset, it's now your responsibility to protect us. It's not our responsibility anymore to support you, it's your responsibility to protect us. Israel is fine. You know, I'm on the side, I'm in the private equity business. I look at businesses in Israel, the prices are insane. You know, Israel raised $25.5 billion of equity capital in their businesses. Tel Aviv is the most expensive city in the entire world. The Jews in Israel are doing fine. It's an amazing country. They got a great army. It's beautiful. It's got great weather. People are doing fine. We're not doing so fine. They're doing fine. And we have to support Israel, but most importantly, we have to support Israel because that's the future for all of us.
And so like Ambassador Friedman, I'm going to mirror wild optimism about the state of Israel itself. Israel has never been in better position than it is now, largely thanks to the efforts of Ambassador Friedman and the Trump administration. The Abraham Accords are an extraordinary game changer. He's not going to tout his own work, so I will. The Abraham Accords are an extraordinary game changer. It is the first time that there has been a ground shift in the nature of understanding about Israel's relations with its neighbors. There was a going theory for decades, and it was a lie. And everything in the Middle East was stagnant because of Israel versus the Palestinians. That was obviously proved to be a lie. It turns out that countries surrounding Israel also wish to have economic opportunity. They wish to have common defense. And ironically, thanks to President Obama's embrace of Iran, all of these countries realized that perhaps the chief threat didn't lie with the Jews in Israel, it lay, in fact, with the mullahs in Iran, and they started to form alliances with Israel. That is only going to increase and expand as it becomes more and more effective over time. That's an extraordinary thing. So on the foreign front, Israel is doing better than it ever has in my lifetime, and I can tell you that, and I'm sure Ambassador Friedman would mirror this, there are many other countries that would love to have jumped on the Abraham Accords, and if Donald Trump had been reelected, would have. He can't say it, so again, I will. The country that comes to mind here is Saudi Arabia, which almost certainly would have normalized relations if President Trump had been reelected, and may in fact normalize relations anyway. Then there is the domestic situation in Israel. Obviously, everything has been held up by the insanity of having an election every 2.5 days. And the bizarre COVID policy of playing the hokey pokey with opening and closing its borders, and getting people jabbed until 80% of their body weight is made up of the vaccine. And listen, vaccines are good. I just don't want 80% of my body weight made up of it. You know, you put all that aside. The simple fact is that Israel underwent a ground shift after the Gaza pullout, in which the left no longer exists in Israel. The Labor Party, which used to win elections on a regular basis, is now a fringe, tiny party. The left-wing party in Israel is actually a center-wing party in Israel in Kahol Lavan. If you measure it out, right now in Israel, about 80 of the 120 seats are considered center to right in Israel. Why? Because Israel recognized in the entire Israeli population in the aftermath of the Gaza pullout and the subsequent Gaza war, recognized that there was an existential threat that was not going to be solved purely by Israeli concessions, and that there was very little debate over foreign policy. This is what shocked the world. For those of us who were watching politics, I mean, Ambassador Friedman wasn't shocked by it, I wasn't shocked by it. When Naftali Bennett became prime minister and foreign policy didn't shift one iota, nobody really should have been shocked by that. But of course the press was, because the idea was that Bibi Netanyahu was the big baddie, as opposed to the real fact of the matter, which is that Israel faces down existential threats on its border. Its entire population understands this, and they're not playing games with that anymore. Israel, despite all of the insane sort of arguments they have with each other, is significantly more cohesive as a population than the United States is right now. There's more agreement on centralized principle for what the state of Israel is and can be. And I mean, if I have one piece of advice for the state of Israel, lower your corporate tax rate to 10% and you will eat everybody's lunch on planet Earth. The only reason more people aren't investing in place with the unbelievable intellectual capital that Israel is because they have an insane tax regulatory structure. So, you know, as far as opportunity, like, again, I'm extraordinarily, positive on the future of the state of Israel. If Israel were able to do that economically speaking, it would also ensure their survivability for generations to come, because it turns out that the world runs on power, and Israel has never had oil, but Israel does have unbelievable intellectual capital and technological advancements. You make yourself more vital, and just like Vladimir Putin can run half of Western Europe by opening a pipeline, Israel can have enormous world weight by opening its technology sphere to broader investment. As far as the United States and world support, again, the stronger Israel is, it's just like, as Ambassador Friedman was saying about Jews on a personal level, the stronger you are, the more respect people will have for you. And the stronger Israel is, the more people will have respect for the state of Israel. The less Israel goes with its hand out to the rest of the world seeking solace and comfort, the less the rest of the world will feel bad giving it, is sort of my view. So it's not a stretch to say I'm optimistic. I'm wildly optimistic about what Israel does over the course of the next couple decades.
What a great note to end a great evening on. Optimism, positivity, the best is yet to come for the state of Israel, the people of Israel, the U.S.-Israel relationship. We're so grateful to all of you for coming tonight. It means the world. But the work was not coming here tonight and listening. It was a long evening, but all worthwhile. That's the easy part. The work is when we leave. There's a lot more to do. There's a lot more to advocate for. We talked about specific causes that we hope to have to hold Congress accountable for, that all aid to Palestinians should be conditioned on the return of the bodies of Hadar Golden and Aron Shaul. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. And there's a cost to our doing this work, putting together this evening and future projects that we're working on and that we're working on together. So if you find in your hearts on your way out, there's a table, there's an opportunity to give. We have costs that we need to cover, and there's work that needs to be done, and we need your help. None of us are benefiting personally, and we're not getting rich from it. We simply want to continue to advance this agenda. So again, from the bottom of my heart, I want to thank Pastor Mario Bramnick, the Latino Coalition for Israel, for their partnership this evening. Thank all of you for being here. Enormous thank you to Ambassador Friedman, not just for tonight. Ambassador Friedman, we had fun tonight, but there were 4 years that were probably not so fun all the time. Your leadership, your work, your heroism, you are a part of history. And tonight we are so deeply indebted. Then your friendship, your leadership, your being that voice for Israel and many other topics of moral clarity and truth. Thank you for all that you do on a daily basis. Thank you for being here tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight, the night celebrating Israel.